James Forman Jr. is a professor at the Yale Law School. He's the son of the distinguished civil rights activist James Forman, who was most notably associated with SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, in the 1960s. The younger Forman spent 6 years as a public defender in D.C., an experience that is central to the analysis presented in his book, Locking Up Our Own Crime and Punishment in Black America. In my opening question, I asked Forman to explore the limitations of the new Jim Crow argument, which he expressed in a review of Michelle Alexander's book published in the Yale Law Journal. He demurred some, but what I was getting after is a point that he makes in that review, that while the original Jim Crow made no class distinctions among black people, mass incarceration does. Most of our present population, regardless of color, comes from the ranks of the poor. Just 1% to 2% of the people behind bars, for example, have college degrees, and the risk of a black college graduate going to prison actually declined between 1979 and 1999. There is no doubt that our criminal justice system is deeply racist, but saying that it revives Jim Crow obscures some important points. Okay, on to James Forman Jr. The Michelle Alexander book, The New Jim Crow, has been a very influential thing. It's shaped the way a lot of people think about the problems of mass incarceration. I first became aware of your work with your review of her book, and then your book developed some of those themes. But the whole New Jim Crow model is not necessarily a fruitful way to think about mass incarceration, is it?
Well, I think it partially is. So I would want to start there, because I think in a lot of ways my book is building on that work more so than rebutting it. And so I don't think we can understand the history of this country, and certainly not the history of the criminal justice system, without really deeply understanding the role that racism has played in forming every structure of our government, of our Constitution, of our legal system, of our criminal justice system, of our policing structures. And so I think that the New Jim Crow, and not just the New Jim Crow, but books like Just Mercy by Brian Stevenson, Between the World and Me by Ta-Nehisi Coates, and many other books that are less well known, but that academics have been producing over the last 10 and 15 years, I think have done, and really more than that, 20, 25 years, have done an amazing job of documenting all of the ways in which indifference to Black suffering has helped to create the criminal justice system that we have today. For me, and indeed, those motivations and that critique is part of what led me to become a public defender in the 1990s. And what I learned when I became a public defender in Washington, D.C., and practiced in a majority African-American jurisdiction with a police force that was majority Black, and judges, many of whom were African-American, and a legislature that was passing gun laws and drug laws that was majority African-American. What I learned was that although that critique is correct in many ways, it doesn't tell the whole story, because I was grappling with why so many of my African-American counterparts in the criminal justice system didn't see it as the civil rights issue. I became a public defender because I saw this work as the civil rights issue of my generation. But when I go in and I practice in criminal court in Washington, D.C., and I have clients that are receiving extremely long sentences, handed down in many cases from African-American elected officials and judges, I have to stop and ask myself the question, is this the whole story? That is to say, is racism and white supremacy, which is central, but is it the whole story? And that's what I try to explore in my book, is the other forces that are at play that help to explain how we got to 2.2 million people in prison, 7 million people under criminal justice supervision. So I think I'm adding to that account as opposed to contradicting it.
So you open the book with some stories from the 70s of, first, there was an effort in the D.C. City Council, and D.C. at this point had just won home rule from Congress, right? So we had a new city council, new mayor, new system of government, and they were contemplating reducing the penalties for marijuana possession at a time when that was a popular move. It's taken, 40 years to get back to there now. But what about that issue of softening the penalties for marijuana possession? How did that play out in the mid-1970s?
Well, this is one of the things that I found the most striking when I began the research. So I knew that I wanted to write a book that really tried to look at what's happened in our criminal justice system over the last 40 and 50 years through the lens of African-American elected officials, judges, prosecutors, police chiefs, police officers, and activists. And DC was the natural city to use as a study because, as you say, in 1975, DC achieved a measure of home rule. And what that included was the right to elect a majority black city council. And through some quirks in our legal structure, that meant that the city council, after a couple of years, had the authority to pass criminal law, right? So what normally would be the responsibility of state government in DC was passed by this majority black city council. In the first city council in 1975, which included, among other people, Marion Barry, who would later famously go on to become mayor, 11 out of the 13 members were African American. And one of the first things that the city council debated was whether to decriminalize marijuana, which, as you say, was something that was being contemplated and had passed in a number of states. Jimmy Carter was even talking about it at the federal level as a possibility. In DC, the push for marijuana decriminalization came from one of the two white members of the city council, actually, a guy with an unusual biography, Dave Clark. He went to Howard Law School. He worked with Martin Luther King organizing the Poor People's March in 1968. And he went on to become a lawyer for poor people himself before deciding to put his hat in the ring and run for city council. And he won. And he pushed immediately to decriminalize marijuana possession. What was fascinating to me was the opposition. The opposition came from principally African-American ministers and a black city council member, black nationalists, also a minister by the name of Doug Moore. And here's the crucial thing to understand about their opposition. Because if you had asked me before I went into this research, first of all, I would have been surprised to know that that had been the leading source of the opposition, given everything we know today about the damage the drug war has done to African-American communities. But more than that, I would have assumed, well, if people were opposed, they were people that just didn't have the black community's best interests at heart. But that's not it. It's more complicated than that. The black ministers who led the opposition very much did so out of a real heartfelt concern that marijuana would be a gateway drug to harder drugs, including heroin. To an extent, many people laugh at that today, but it's important to understand that in 1975, the nation had just come off of its first real round of battle with heroin addiction. In DC in 1963, they tested everybody entering the DC jail for heroin. 3% of the people tested positive. By 1969, it was 45%. So this is an epidemic that's destroying black communities, and lots of members of the black establishment and influential African Americans are saying, hey, don't decriminalize marijuana, because if you do, our young people will start there and move on to heroin. Jackie Robinson, the baseball hero, went around to black churches and community groups in the early 1970s and said, don't decriminalize marijuana because my son Jackie Jr. is a heroin addict and he started with marijuana. Right? So this moved a lot of the opposition. So it wasn't that they didn't care about black young people. They did care. They just underestimated the harms of criminalization, and they overstated the harms of marijuana use.
You say at several points in the book that we look and see this system now where we've got millions of people behind bars, millions more under control of the criminal justice system. And it's easy to forget that it took a whole series of decisions over the years, little decisions in many different jurisdictions, to get us to this place. I mean, this is a really complicated history. There's no simple story of how we got to over 2 million people behind bars.
Well, I think that's right. And that, in a lot of ways, is the heart of my argument. I think it's so tempting when we look at something so massive and such a profound human rights crisis. It's tempting to try to search for, a particular speech. I read book after book that says, well, Nixon launched the war on crime and then Reagan launched the war on drugs. And of course they did. They did these things, and those absolutely contributed. But what I want to point out to readers is so many of the smaller, tiny decisions that we barely even notice, that in many cases were made by people who were much more well-intentioned than somebody like a Richard Nixon or a Ronald Reagan that contributed to this. So one of the stories that I tell in the book is about the city council member. Actually, it's the same one, Dave Clark, and how in the early 80s he's bombarded with letters from constituents saying that there are addicts nodding off. Heroin has come back, and people are sitting on my stoop and they're nodding off and they're bothering my kids as I walk to school, and you got to do something about it. And what Dave Clark does is he takes those letters and he sends them to the head of the relevant public agency. He gets a letter back from the head of the agency who says, yeah, we're on it. We got you, Councilman Clark. We received this complaint. Clark forwards those letters back to the constituent, and you think, okay, well, he's done his job. But what's the agency that he sends it to? Does he send it to the head of the Department of Mental Health, the head of Addiction Services, the head of drug treatment? No, he sends it to the police chief. Because in this country, even somebody like a Dave Clark, who's a liberal, who's pro-legalization, somebody like him still thinks of an addict sitting on a corner, nodding off, bothering a citizen as a police problem, not as a treatment problem, not as a counseling problem, not as a mental health and recovery problem. The point that I make in the book is those sorts of tiny decisions like that, the choice to refer a letter from a constituent to the police chief rather than to the head of addiction services, those choices over 50 states, 3,000 counties, across our criminal justice system, over 50 years, help to produce mass incarceration. And just one more thing on that, it's not just the system that we think of, that is to say, the police, prosecutors, probation officers, it's also private employers. So I really challenge people. There are a number of stories in my book where people got arrested for small amounts of marijuana in one case, heroin in another case, and then they lost their jobs. That's not the responsibility of the criminal justice system in large part. That's the responsibility of private industry. So I want everybody who's listening to this audience thinking about this issue, turning to themselves and asking, well, what are my employer's policies about hiring people with criminal convictions? Do we have a blanket exclusion? Do we discourage people even from applying by having the second or third question on the application form be, do you have a criminal conviction? In many cases, the answer will be yes. And what I want to say to people is, you're responsible too, right? That's one of the arguments of this book, is that we can't call this a they problem. We can't call this a them problem. We need to understand this as an us problem. We've created it, and we've got to fix it. And that means all of us.